So I remember from the earliest, I used to have a lot of nightmares when I was a child, and I don't know if any of you have experienced that, but all throughout childhood and even persisting into adulthood, that's a present theme. And so a lot of times I would be afraid of the dark, right? I wouldn't want to walk in the dark by myself, and I think it's such a trite thing, or even heights. My whole life I was terrified of heights. And then in 2007, I signed up to go on a mission trip to Mexico and get on a plane. I had never done that in my life, okay? Which is like the worst thing for me. I did not want to get on a plane. But I felt this compelling, this draw to do this work. And to be honest, I've been in ministry ever since. Ever since I got back, I've been preaching and doing this. And then, I always also had this fear of being alone. I'm not going to ask a show of hands, but I think this is a pretty pervasive and common fear. I had a fear of public speaking, and then I had to take a public speaking class in Montville. I was always afraid of being alone. I graduated college, we moved to North Carolina, and I was alone all the time. I was afraid of losing someone close to me, and then in 2011, my aunt passed away from ovarian cancer. Devastating. She was like a second mom to us. She wasn't able to have children. And so it hit deep. I remember being in North Carolina, and the elections were going on, and Ebola was happening. And, they were bringing a doctor back from Liberia to be treated. And the elections were, again, around that time, in those same couple of years. And I don't think I've even told my wife this. There was one day where I've been listening to the radio or watching stuff so much that I just went home and I got on the bed, and I got on the covers, and I listened to the radio, and I was afraid. Okay? I'm being kind of vulnerable here, okay? I'm telling you like things I've not told you. And I think that was a breaking point for me. That was a breaking point for me because I said, that is not a Christ-like behavior. That does not exemplify being a Christian. Here I am, a preacher, trying to lead people toward God, and what am I doing? I'm sitting here trying to hide myself. This has to stop. And as I look back over all of those themes, what's really interesting, and I'll talk about this towards the end, is the doctor that they brought back, Dr. Kent Brantley. I met him in October. The most compassionate man I've ever met. He's a really cool guy. And what I look at, I see all those fears, and then God thrusts me right into the middle of what is the most fearful for me. But He doesn't leave me there. He doesn't leave you there alone. He extends His hand into the midst of that silent darkness and says, are you willing to have enough faith to grab it? We all have fears, and fear is it's an important and it's a natural human response, right? You're afraid of snakes, don't handle snakes, all right? I've been known to handle a snake a time or two, but not in a worship service, you can be sure. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that might not happen for illustrative purposes. But we have these fears, and these fears are natural, and it's okay when there's something unknown or something that's scary to feel that tinge of fear within, right? I mean, it's fair to say if I asked a show of hands, how many of you have been afraid of something? Everybody would, and if you don't raise your hand, you're either a robot or you're lying, okay? But there's a different kind of fear that I see creeping into our society, and unfortunately, not just within our society, but within the church. And I want to term this afflictive fear, right? Those terms came to me, and then I was like, wait a second, I want to go and look up what both those terms mean, right? And they're almost synonymous. right? To be afflicted means to kind of be in this constant duress or distress or grief over something. Fear is to have a response or a state towards something that may be dangerous, we perceive as being dangerous. And so I kind of put those together and said, afflictive fear is being in a state of great distress over the presence of danger. This often leads to isolation and shutdown or to the closing of open doors. Afflictive fear does not produce flourishing. Okay? Afflictive fear does not promote community. Afflictive fear does not bring us to the best of who we are as the humankind. And it certainly doesn't live up to the standard God's called us to as the people of God. Afflictive fear is a base human desire that takes a small fraction of rationality and makes it very irrational to where we react and overreact out of a state of living here, right? Let's look at 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1. I'm just going to begin in verse 3. Paul here is writing to Timothy, trying to guide him through some really difficult terrain in terms of ministering to these people. He says, I thank God whom I serve as did my ancestors with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers night and day. As I remember your tears, I long to see you, that I may be filled with joy. I am reminded of your sincere faith, a faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. For this reason, I remind you to fan into the flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. I talked to the class Wednesday night about this interpretive principle called mirror reading, and Paul does a lot of that, or you can do a lot of that with Paul's letters, where you look at the text, and even if you might not know things behind it, you can see from it that there are some situations going on. You kind of piece together what's taking place there. And even in just the short, brief reading we've had here, what we see is that there are situations that have driven Timothy to tears, right? There are situations that he's encountered that has caused him to be apart and invoke this fear. And Paul looks into that and he says, man, I'm praying for you. And I love you. And fear does not have power over you. Right? You've been given this tremendous gift. What is this gift of God that he's been given? Well, he's been given the gift of faith from his grandmother and his mother. Paul was like his spiritual father. He'd been given the grace of God, deep, rich, fountain flowing within, so that whatever happens in this life, his life will persist on in the protection and the glory of God's presence. He'd been given a spiritual gift of leadership due to Paul laying on his hands on him. Okay, this was a common practice in those days. It's kind of ironic we're talking about that this morning, right? He laid his hands on him to empower him with the Spirit so that he could lead. It's a very, very powerful type of scene. And so Timothy had received all these gifts from God. And Paul's saying, I want you to remember that. I want you to reflect on all the ways that God has provided for you along the way. Think about all of the situations that have been present in your life You didn't know where to turn or how they were going to turn out. And yet you're sitting here today saying, I survived that, and God led me through that. Think about all of the challenges that come about that we don't have the resources or the ability to meet, and yet God has led you through that. That's what Paul is telling Timothy to think back on. Think on the faith that was given to you. This lineage of faithfulness that you have inherited. This exemplary aspects of the Christian life that you show and that you have been given. Think about those things. See, the gift of God is not fear, right? And this is a really common Greek rhetoric type of practice, just from a textual standpoint. You could go and look at some of the Greek philosophers, the way they would teach is by saying what something was not. Well, it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this. And after you say everything it's not, then you can kind of step into it and say, okay, this is what it is, right? It's even a practice that we have today. It's a really powerful teaching tool. And so Paul begins and says, remember the gift of God that was put into you and fan that flame. But remember, fear is not it. Fear is not from God. If you have that afflictive fear, that is not from God. Okay? If you feel that afflictive fear start to rise up in your chest, into your throat, you grab it by the, and I'm going to be a little bit visceral here, you grab that thought by the throat and you wrangle it down and you remind that fear, who is your king? Because if you don't, if you give it a square inch of your mind, it will take control. Because fear begets fear and it begins to culminate. It's like a snowball. It just continues to compound. And it's harder to stop as it gets bigger and bigger and more powerful and more powerful. And so Paul here is telling him, look, fan this flame, this gift you've been given. But know that this fear that you feel is not a part of it. So how do we overcome? Well, Paul tells Timothy that this gift is about love, and it's about power, and it's about self-control. Not power over the elements, not power over circumstances that are outside of our control, power over the one who lives in here. Right? The one who lives here, the people of God. How do we gain that kind of power over? Well, we realize that love is greater than fear. That selfless love really is the truest and highest way. And we also realize that we have the gift of self-control. These are all traits of the Holy Spirit, aren't they? I mean, these are not things, and this is the important thing to think about. You may not feel like you have the ability to have self-control over your thoughts or your emotions or your feelings or your fears, but you don't have to. Because you have the Spirit of God living within you who wants to produce that in your life. Do you trust Him for that? Are you willing to release the power that you want to have to allow God's power to reign within? See, it does no good to preach on the peace that passes all understanding and then go out and be the church that reflects the world's fears back to you. So we have to, as the people of God, have this self-control that's not rooted in our own feelings or own behavior, but rooted within the power that God is producing within our life. Our common life together. Right? And when you lack that confidence or that courage, that's why we're on this journey together. You lean into a brother or sister who can help lead you in that way. We can't do that if we isolate. So I want to think about some examples of this truth throughout Christian history. And I want to read, there's an interesting article I found that Eric in Texas wrote. And he wrote this back in 2014. But he was talking about a terrible plague that happened. It's called the Cyprian plague, or the plague of Cyprian, because Cyprian was the one who kind of chronicled what had happened. And so this happened around 250 and 270, between 250 and 270 AD. This is a 20-year time period. I just want you to think about it. That's a generation. A whole generation grew up in this plague. And it was believed now that it might have been smallpox. But he writes that it devastated the Roman Empire. At the height of what came to be known as the Plague of Cyberium, 5,000 people died every day in Rome. Okay? This is serious. This is serious. The plague coincided with the first empire-wide persecution of Christians under Emperor Decius. You want to talk about trying to be a people of God in that day? Think about trying to fight off a plague and an empire. That's tough. That's tough. You talk about the temptation to afflict with fear. I mean, it's present every day. Not surprisingly, Decius and other enemies of the church blamed Christians for the plague. That claim was, however, undermined by two inconvenient facts. First, Christians died from the plague like everybody else. And second, unlike everybody else, they cared for the victims of the plague, including their pagan neighbors. This wasn't new. Christians had done the same thing during the Antonine plague of a century earlier. Rodney Stark wrote in The Rise of Christianity that Christians stayed in the afflicted cities when pagan leaders, including their physicians, fled. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day about this, trying to get some guidance, and he was saying, well, a dead doctor is not very useful. I said, yeah, but neither is one that's absent. Okay? You got to have both. I mean, you got to have the courage to be able to stay in there and be the responders to help those who are in need. Now, that doesn't mean we act reckless or we do inane and dumb things. Candide Moss, professor of New Testament and early Christianity at Notre Dame, notes that an epidemic that seemed like the end of the world actually promoted the spread of Christianity. By their actions in the face of possible death, Christians showed their neighbors that Christianity is worth dying for. Which gets me back to Dr. Brantley. You see this picture here on the front of Time magazine. The first American, I believe, to contract Ebola. And if you know anything about Ebola, or if you remember when that was, and it's still a battle, but it's getting better, it's very, very visceral in its effects. Deadly. I mean, almost every person that gets this dies, or at least it was at that time. Very, very dangerous. He had taken a lot of precautions. He talked about this at the retreat I was on with him. He said the only thing that he can think of as how he caught it was he went to comfort a girl whose mom had just died from it. And she must have had it, and he didn't know that. And she didn't know that. And so he comforted her, he gave her a hug, and then she went off, and he contracted this virus. And it was, to hear him describe it was, I can't begin to do it justice. Lots of people praying for him, lots of medical care. And he survived, obviously. And as soon as it was over, his wife said, all right, now that you're better, when are we going to go back? I mean, that's a small children. And he stayed in Texas and worked as a doctor for the last few years. And he said, it's really interesting. He said, here in America, when you leave a hospital, then they have someone hired the next day. When you're in an African country and you leave, there's no one to replace you. It's just that many more people that's not going to get care. And so, I think at the beginning of this year, he moved back to Africa. He's in Zambia, trying to fight more illnesses and difficult things. You know, Lance brought up David Lipscomb. What I'm telling you is that the Christian response, the normative Christian response through all history, is that we don't run from problems or challenges, no, we run towards them to be the responders to help. Love. We talk about our motto is love, share, serve. It's easy to do that when things are easy, or we're going to live that out and embody that when things are not easy. Okay? And so I left the third one, what will be here? When we look back over this in the next few years, the next few decades, maybe hundreds of years from now, when people look back at our time, what will the church's response be? Well, they say the church rose up and met the need. The church rose up and loved their neighbors well. Well, they say, well, the church just looked like the rest of everyone else. Because in the event that this is all overblown, and we all look back and we'll say, did we maintain our character? Right? There are things worse than death. Losing your character is one of those. Now, you can always regain it because God's grace is renewed and offer every single day. But I remember a Bible teacher I had when I was in Cookville at the church that I served at. A very wealthy businessman, but at one time he went bankrupt. And he was staring that calamity in the face. And he said he had a Christian brother. I put his arm around him and he said, "You didn't lose anything." And he looked at him, he's like, "What do you mean I didn't lose anything? I just lost all my everything, my whole possessions. I might be homeless." And I've heard many people say this, but you lose your wealth, you've really lost nothing. You lose your health, you've lost something. But if you lose your character, you've lost everything. When they look back at the church here and centuries beyond, what I hope they see is that we are people of character. That we don't lose our minds or our character just because of an affliction. That we have, again, a long obedience in the same direction. That we are pursuing the kingdom of God wherever God leads us. So how do we have this power over afflictive fear? Well, we trust the King of the cosmos first. It's like the gates of hell won't prevail against the church, but a little pathogen might. That's not what Jesus told us. So we trust the King of the cosmos. He's going to do what's best and right. And we rest in that kind of peace. Second, we seek the kingdom amid the concerns. We look at the anxiety-laden systems that are around us. And what I think is so interesting is that things like this show just how fragile the systems we set up to give ourselves security and protection really are. Right? They are very fragile. Teetering on an edge. But the day-to-day life says, oh, I'm secure in that. Your only security is in the kingdom of God. And as kingdom people, we have to take trust and confidence in that. So seek God's kingdom amid the concerns. Seek God's kingdom amid. Ask God every day, God, what is it you want me to be doing? What do you want us as the church to be doing amid this? How can we exemplify the kingdom at this time? And be the kingdom witness over the chaos. We are the part of the people of God. We are part of the kingdom. Let us display the kingdom to the world. Because it very well may be that this is one of the best opportunities we've had in our life to show the world what the kingdom's really about. So let us be kingdom people, not just talk about it. Don't live in fear. Don't live in fear. The worst thing that can happen to me is that I die. And I would be devastated if I had to leave my family. I would be devastated if I had to leave the church. I would be devastated to not continue on many more years. I would be devastated on everyone's behalf. And I would hope that you wouldn't mourn too long, but we'll get back to work. But death is not the end for us as believers, right? It's just the beginning to the new thing. I mean, Paul said that, right? To live is Christ and to die is gain. And again, don't misunderstand me. And I'm going to address address this in this next point. I'm not talking about being reckless or stupid. Okay? But what I am calling us to do is to be realistic, to have a vision of the greater reality in the midst of this. You know, how many of you have ever watched The Matrix? The movie was put out in the late 90s. Keanu Reeves. I love his name. Keanu means cool breeze over the mountains. Right? He didn't seem like that in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures. He didn't seem like a cool breeze in that. But you know, in that movie, the whole movie is premised really on a philosophy from Plato. But the whole movie is about that there's these people who seem to be living normal lives. They seem to be in this world and they're doing normal things. But in truth, they're actually hooked up to machines, and machines are running the world and feeding off these people, right? And he has to wake up. He has to wake up from that and see the greater reality that's going on. We as the people of God can see the greater reality of God's kingdom purposes in history. God showed it to us. He's told us. He's led us on this way. We can see that. Let us not be asleep in the midst of this, allowing ourselves to incline ourselves towards base fears when we are able to see a greater reality beyond this one. Also, let us practice good neighbor love. And what that means is not only taking care of those who are sick, but helping to prevent spread from those who are not, or who are not, right? We may be adjusting how we do some things as a part of that good neighborhood. But I would encourage you, this year, we're talking about growing up together. We've asked you to choose three. Choose someone who's you see is further ahead of you on the spiritual path, someone that you can, or a peer with, that you can walk beside, and someone who's just beginning that you can reach a hand to lead up. Stay in contact with those three people on a weekly basis. If you've not chosen those people, right now is a beautiful time to start that. Stay in contact. Let each other know that you're praying for them, that you're supporting them. A phone call is ultimately safe. You are not going to catch anything for talking to someone on the phone. So call somebody and tell them that you're praying for them and checking them. In best case, this is all over the bar and we get back to life as usual. In worst case, it gets really severe. They're going to need your support. They're going to need your loving care and concern and prayers. Let's begin that now. Let's begin that now. If there was a case, and I'm just trying to put all cards on the table here. If there was a case where our hospital, in a worst case scenario, was overrun and lacked space, and there were a great need, I would hope that we would have the courage to open our doors and say, you can be here, and we will take care of you. Starting with the church family. Starting with the church family, but also our neighbors who maybe aren't part of it. Practice good neighbor love. Embrace, display, and proclaim from the Spirit God has given us. Kingdom power, selfless love, resolute self-control. That's what our goal is. Kingdom power, selfless love, resolute self-control. Stay informed, but not inundated. Okay? Inundation creates fear. Information helps to remove fear. Right? So stay informed. Don't listen to a lot of the false ideas out there. I know there was a great article, Jamie and all of the sellers who were talking about this week that, you just spread some Chick-fil-A sauce packets over your doorpost, and the angel of coronavirus will pass over your house. You will not catch it, okay? Oh, that's really entertaining. That's probably not true, okay? So beware of false information. That's okay? That was meant to be a joke, okay? So, but there's a lot of information that's being put out that's not meant that way. Conspiracy theories amok in situations like this. Also, selfless love also requires not to stockpile at the expense of someone else, right? Not to stockpile at the expense of someone else. Gradually build up goods as you feel like you will need them, but not stockpile them so that no one else. So I went to Kroger this week and the paper aisle was empty. There was no paper, and I'm told to not shake people's hands, so I guess I'm not supposed to shake people's hands because there's no more toilet paper. I don't know why. Lindsay told me not to say that. But think about your neighbor. Think about your brother and sister amid this. Because the more you think about yourself in this, the more afflictive fear will try to grip you. See the needs and welfare of others. Thank you all for being here this morning. As this continues to move forward, as a church family, we will be in touch and continue to stay closely connected because it evolves and changes every day. But through the midst of it, what doesn't change is our steadfast commitment to the loving way of God's kingdom. Amen? Amen. So let us be resolute. Let us be steadfast. Let us be immovable in a time when it's very scary for a lot of people. And let us not trivialize the fears either. Okay? Fear is very real, at least when it's inside of you. Okay? So let us take care to acknowledge people's real fears, but also help point them towards a God who's greater. Let us choose faith over fear as we stand.